300 people watched my sister walk toward my husband's casket holding a secret that would destroy our entire family. My sister stood up in the middle of my husband's funeral and handed the funeral director a sealed envelope, and told him not to close the casket until everyone in that room knew what was inside it. I was holding a program with his photo on it. My hands were shaking so hard the paper made a sound, a small dry rattling sound, and that's the detail I remember most, not what she said next, just that sound. 300 people turned around in their seats. My name is Mara Whitfield. I was 36 years old the week my husband Daniel died, and for 6 of those years I had believed my younger sister Renee loved me the way sisters are supposed to love each other, which is to say imperfectly but completely. I was wrong about a lot of things that year. That was only the first one. Daniel and I met at a fundraising gala when I was 28, the kind of event where everyone is performing warmth and he was the only person in the room who seemed to actually mean it. He worked in commercial real estate, the kind of job where men learn to read a room before they read a contract, and he read me accurately within about 4 minutes. He told me later it was my laugh. I told him it was his shoes, scuffed at the heel, the only imperfect thing about him in a room full of polish. We married 2 years later in a backyard, not a ballroom, because Daniel said he didn't want our wedding to look like one of his closings. My sister Renee was my maid of honor. She cried during my vows, actual tears, not the performance kind, and I remember thinking watching her, that I had never loved anyone the way I loved her in that moment, not even Daniel. Renee was 4 years younger than me. We grew up close in the specific way 2 sisters get close when their parents are gone more than their home. Renee handling our father's moods, me handling Renee. I left for college and she stayed in Westfield, Indiana, working at our father's hardware store until he sold it, then drifting through jobs the way some people drift through relationships. Never quite landing, always one good idea away from finally landing. I helped her financially more than either of us ever said out loud. A security deposit here. A car repair there. 6 months of rent in 2019 when her bookkeeping business folded. Daniel never once complained about it. He'd just write the check and hand it to me and say, "Your sister, your call," and that was the whole conversation. That was the warm detail I held on to. The one I should have looked at harder. Because there was a red flag, a small one, a throwaway one, and I dismissed it the way you dismiss things you don't want to be true. 8 months before Daniel died, Renee asked me almost casually over coffee, what would happen to the house if something ever happened to him? Not to me. To him. I told her that was a strange question. She laughed and said she was just being practical, that's all, somebody has to think about these things. I didn't think about it again for 8 months. Daniel died on a Tuesday. March 11th, 9:52 p.m. An aortic dissection, the doctor said, which is a phrase I had never heard before and have heard in my sleep almost every night since. He was 41. He went into the bathroom complaining of pain between his shoulder blades, and by the time the paramedics got him to St. Vincent's he was already gone. And I remember the doctor's face more clearly than I remember my husband's, because the doctor's face was the last new piece of information I received before my whole life became something I was simply enduring rather than living. Something wasn't right in the days after. I told myself it was grief making me paranoid. Something wasn't right. Renee called 4 times the first night, not to check on me I realized later, but to ask very specific questions. Had Daniel updated his will recently? Did I know where he kept his important documents? Was the house in both our names or just his? Something wasn't right, and I let myself not notice it because noticing it felt like a betrayal of the only family I had left. There were other signs too, smaller ones, the kind you only see clearly in the rearview mirror. Renee showed up at the house 4 days after the funeral was scheduled, before I'd even picked a casket, and spent an hour in Daniel's home office with the door closed. She told me she was looking for old photos of him for a memorial slideshow. I believed her. I wanted so badly to believe her. I noticed she'd started parking down the block instead of in the driveway, the way you'd park if you didn't want someone to know exactly how long you'd been somewhere. I noticed her phone was always face down on whatever surface was nearest. I noticed she stopped finishing sentences when I walked into rooms. I told myself, she's grieving too. He loved him like a brother. That's all this is. I put the thought down. I don't know why I didn't pick it back up. The night before the funeral I couldn't sleep, so I sat at Daniel's desk going through his email, trying to find people to notify, business contacts, old friends. I found a folder I didn't recognize, labeled only with a date from 4 months earlier. I opened it. There were 3 documents inside. I read the first line of the first one and my stomach dropped in a way I didn't have words for yet. I closed the laptop before I could read the rest. I told myself I'd deal with it after the funeral. That was the last night everything still felt like something I understood. The funeral was at Sacred Heart, the church Daniel's mother had attended for 40 years, and it was full in a way that should have comforted me and instead just made the whole thing feel like a performance I hadn't agreed to be part of. 300 people. His business partners. His college roommate who flew in from Seattle. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, 71 years old, sitting in the front row in a navy suit, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Renee sat 2 rows behind me. I noticed that. I noticed it and didn't understand why it bothered me until much later. The service was almost over. Father Donnelly had finished the eulogy. The funeral director, a quiet, careful man named Hugh Pemberton, had just stepped forward to explain the procession to the cemetery, when Renee stood up. She didn't walk to the front the way you'd expect, slowly, respectfully. She moved fast, in heels, down the side aisle, and there was a manila envelope in her hand, the kind you'd get from a courier service, and I remember thinking with a strange detached clarity, that envelope is too clean. It hasn't been folded. It's been carried carefully. Hugh, wait. Her voice carried. She wasn't whispering. Don't close it yet. The room did the thing 300 people do when something has gone wrong in public. It went silent in stages, back to front like a wave reversing. Renee. I stood up. I don't remember deciding to stand up. What are you doing? She turned to me, and I will remember her face for the rest of my life, because it wasn't grief on it. It wasn't even anger. It was something closer to relief, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and was finally setting it down in the worst possible place. I had a DNA test run, she said. On Daniel. Before the embalming. I paid the funeral home's lab technician to take a sample. I heard someone behind me say, my God, very quietly. A DNA test for what? My voice didn't sound like mine. Renee, what are you talking about? For paternity. She held the envelope up like evidence, like she was in a courtroom instead of a church. I have reason to believe Daniel is not who you think he was. I think there's a child out there who deserves to know the truth before this family buries it with him. I want to be honest about something because Daniel always told me honesty mattered more than dignity, and I think he'd want me to tell this part exactly as it happened, not the flattering version. For about 4 seconds I believed her. For seconds in which my entire marriage rearranged itself in my mind. Every late client dinner, every weekend golf trip, every time his phone buzzed and he silenced it without looking. For seconds in which I became, in my own head, a woman who hadn't known her husband at all. Then Eleanor stood up. My mother-in-law was 71 years old and had not raised her voice above a museum quiet register in the 11 years I'd known her, and she stood up in that pew and said, loud enough for the back row to hear, that is enough. Renee, that is enough. Eleanor, I'm trying to protect this family. You are trying to protect yourself, Eleanor said, and I don't yet know from what, but I intend to find out. I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. Hugh Pemberton, to his credit, stepped between Renee and the casket with the calm of a man who had clearly never once in 30 years of funeral direction expected to need that particular skill. Ma'am, I need to ask you to sit down or to step outside. I have the results, Renee said, and her voice cracked for the first time, and I almost felt sorry for her. I have them right here. I just think Mara deserves to know before she buries a lie. She held the envelope out to me. I didn't take it. I didn't move. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning cycle on. I could hear Eleanor breathing beside me, fast and shallow. I could hear, absurdly, a child 2 pews back ask her mother in a stage whisper what's happening, and the mother shushing her. I looked at my sister, who I had shared a bedroom with for 14 years, who I had paid rent for, bailed out, defended at family dinners for 2 decades, and I asked her the only question that mattered. Where did you get a sample of Daniel's DNA, Renee? Before I'd even chosen a casket. Something shifted in her face. A half-second flicker, gone almost before I caught it. The look of someone who has rehearsed an answer for the question they expected, and is now being asked a different one. I told you. The lab technician. How did you know to call a lab technician 4 days after my husband died? How did you have a number for one? Silence. Renee. How long have you been planning this? She didn't answer. 300 people watched her not answer. And that was when I understood, with the kind of clarity that arrives a beat too late to be useful, that whatever this was, it had nothing to do with paternity and everything to do with something Renee wanted and had wanted for a long time, and had decided my husband's funeral was the moment to take. I didn't cry. I know that sounds cold. I had cried for 4 straight days before that morning, and apparently my body had decided it was done, because what I felt standing in that church wasn't grief anymore. It was something colder and steadier, and it didn't have a name yet. It would, by the end of that year. It would have several. Renee left the church before the burial. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She walked out the side door she'd come in through, fast in those same heels, and got into a car I didn't recognize, a gray sedan with a man behind the wheel I'd never seen before, and that detail, the stranger driving my sister away from my husband's funeral, sat in my chest for 3 days before I let myself ask what it meant. The burial happened anyway. I stood at the graveside in November cold air, Eleanor's hand wrapped around mine so tightly it left marks, and I watched them lower Daniel into the ground while 290 some people pretended not to be thinking about what had just happened inside that church. Afterward, at the house, with the casseroles and the murmured condolences and the specific exhausted hum of a home full of people who don't know how to leave, Eleanor found me in the kitchen. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to not fall apart while I tell you because we don't have time for that right now." "Eleanor." "Daniel called me 6 weeks ago. He asked me not to mention it to you yet, because he didn't want to worry you before he was certain." She paused and I watched her decide to keep going. "He thought your sister was stealing from him." I set down the casserole dish I was holding very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have stopped being reliable. "Stealing what?" "He didn't say exactly. He said he'd noticed money moving in ways he couldn't explain, and that Renee had access to some of his business accounts because of, I don't know, some arrangement, some favor he'd done for her. He said he was going to look into it properly after the Hartwell deal closed." Eleanor's eyes were wet but her voice didn't break. "The Hartwell deal closed 9 days before he died." I didn't sleep that night. I sat at Daniel's desk again, the same laptop, and this time I didn't close the folder. There were 3 documents inside it, dated 4 months before he died. The first was a spreadsheet, Daniel's own, tracking transfers out of an account I didn't know existed. A business account tied to a property management company he co-owned with his college roommate, the one who'd flown in from Seattle. $41,000 had moved out of that account over 5 months, in amounts small enough to not trigger automatic review. $1,800. $2,400. $3,100. Always to the same routing number. The second document was an email thread between Daniel and a forensic accountant named Priya Bhandari, dated 6 weeks before he died. Daniel had written, "I need someone who can trace this without it becoming a conversation at Thanksgiving. I think I know who it is. I just don't understand why yet." The third document stopped me cold. It was a notarized letter, dated 4 months before Daniel died, granting limited financial power of attorney to my sister Renee Calloway, over a holding account connected to our house. I had never seen this letter. I had never signed anything like it. And at the bottom, beneath Daniel's signature, was a second signature. My Mara Whitfield. Except I had never signed it. I stared at my own name in handwriting that was close enough that I understood immediately why no bank teller had ever questioned it, but not mine. The W in Whitfield curled the wrong direction. I make my W's like 2 connected valleys. This one had a small loop at the start, a habit I didn't have and never had. I knew instantly and completely whose handwriting it was. Renee and I had spent 14 years sharing a bedroom, a bathroom, a desk where we both did homework, and somewhere in those years I had watched her practice my signature as a joke, copying my school permission slip so she could forge notes to get out of gym class. We used to laugh about it. She was always better at it than me. I didn't laugh now. I sat very still, the way you sit still when something enormous is happening just beneath the surface of your life and you're afraid that moving will make it real. I called Priya Bhandari the next morning at 8 a.m. She picked up on the second ring, and when I told her who I was, there was a pause on the line that told me everything before she said a word. "I was hoping you'd call," she said. "I have to tell you something and I think you should sit down. I'd actually started to suspect this went further than your husband realized, and what I found in the last week after he passed made me certain of it." "How much further?" "Mrs. Whitfield, I think the $41,000 your husband found was the smallest part of this." I drove to her office that afternoon, a small suite above a dry cleaner in Carmel, Indiana, where Priya had her 2 monitors, her color-coded folders, and a way of speaking that made me trust her within 90 seconds. Careful, exact, no padding. "Your husband hired me to trace $41,000, she said, sliding a folder across the desk. "I traced it. It led to an account opened 18 months ago under a name I want you to look at very closely." I opened the folder. Calloway Property Holdings, LC. Registered agent, Renee Calloway. Co-signer on the account, a name I didn't recognize. Gregory Hale. "Who is Gregory Hale?" I asked. Priya looked at me for a long moment, the look of someone deciding how much weight a person can carry in one sitting. "He's a real estate attorney," she said. "He drafted the power of attorney letter your husband never signed off on. And Mrs. Whitfield, he's been Renee's fiancé for the last year. Nobody in your family seems to know that yet." I thought about the gray sedan outside the church. The stranger behind the wheel. I didn't say anything for a long time. "There's more," Priya said gently. "I don't think your husband's death was unrelated to any of this. I'm not saying it wasn't natural causes. The autopsy was clear on that. But I think the timing matters, and I think you need to see what I found in the account activity from the night he died." Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for months and I had been too grateful, too loyal, too in love with the version of my sister that existed only in 1998 in a shared bedroom in Westfield to see it. I thought about the question she'd asked me 8 months ago over coffee so casually. What happens to the house if something happens to him? Not you, Mara. Him. I drove home that night with the folder on the passenger seat where Daniel used to sit, and somewhere around the county line I had to pull over because my hands were shaking too hard to keep driving, and I sat on the shoulder of Highway 31 for 11 minutes. Doing nothing, saying nothing, just breathing while the full shape of what my sister had built finally came into focus. It wasn't paternity she'd been protecting at that funeral. It was a forgery. A power of attorney. An account. A fiancé no one knew about. And she had walked into a church full of 300 grieving people and tried to burn my husband's name to the ground rather than let me find any of it on my own. Eleanor moved into my guest room the week after the funeral, officially to help me get through the holidays. Unofficially because she'd looked at my face when I told her about Priya's folder and decided I shouldn't be alone in that house with what I now knew. She was 71 years old and she organized our findings on index cards at my kitchen table like she'd been training for this her whole life. Your father-in-law ran a title company for 30 years, she told me the first night, lining up cards in neat rows. I know what a forged document looks like, sweetheart. I just never thought I'd be looking for one in my own family. I went back to Priya's office 2 days later. She'd pulled the account activity from the night Daniel died, and I sat across from her in that small office above the dry cleaner and made myself read every line. At 9:41 p.m., 11 minutes before Daniel collapsed, a transfer request had been submitted from the Callaway Property Holdings account. $86,000. The destination was a different account, one Priya hadn't been able to trace yet, routed through 3 intermediary banks designed, she said, specifically to slow down anyone looking. That's not a coincidence, I said. My voice sounded very far away. I'm not saying it's a coincidence, Priya said carefully. I'm saying I don't yet know what it is. The transfer was submitted at 9:41. It wasn't approved until the next morning after banking hours had reopened, which means whoever submitted it didn't know at 9:41 p.m. that your husband was about to die. Then why does the timing feel like this? Because $86,000 is the kind of number people move when they think a door is about to close. Priya looked at me steadily. Mrs. Whitfield, I think your husband finding that power of attorney letter, and starting to ask questions about it, was the door. I sat with that for a long moment in a small office that smelled like the dry cleaner downstairs, and tried to hold 2 facts in my head at the same time without one collapsing into the other. My husband had died of natural causes. The autopsy was clear, unambiguous, no foul play. A blood vessel that simply gave out the way blood vessels sometimes do in 41-year-old men with a family history no one had ever flagged as urgent. And also, someone had been racing against a clock that closed the night he died. Those 2 facts didn't cancel each other out. They sat next to each other, ugly and unresolved, and I would carry both of them for the rest of that year. I confronted Renee for the first time 8 days after the funeral. Not at her apartment. Eleanor talked me out of going alone, but at a coffee shop in downtown Indianapolis, neutral ground, recorded on my phone in my coat pocket because Priya had told me gently that I should start documenting everything now before I understood why that mattered. Renee looked thinner than she had at the funeral. There were circles under her eyes that even good concealer couldn't fully hide. I know about the power of attorney letter, I said. No greeting. I didn't have one in me. I know my signature on it isn't mine. I know you've known how to forge my handwriting since we were kids. She didn't deny it immediately, which told me more than any denial would have. She looked down at her coffee, turning the cup a quarter turn, then another quarter turn, a habit I recognized from when we were teenagers, and she was deciding how much of a lie to tell. It wasn't supposed to go like this, she said finally. What was it supposed to be like, Renee? Gregory said. She stopped herself. Gregory Hale. Your fiancé. The one nobody in this family has ever met. Her head came up fast. How do you? I have a forensic accountant, Renee. I have 18 months of account activity. I have a folder Daniel started building 4 months before he died, because he noticed money moving out of an account you had access to and he wanted to understand why before he said anything to me. My hands were steady now, which surprised me. Somewhere between the funeral and this coffee shop, the shaking had turned into something else. So I'm going to ask you one more time and I want you to actually answer it. What is Callaway Property Holdings, and why does it have $86,000 of someone's dollars moving through it 11 minutes before my husband collapsed? Renee's face did something I'd never seen it do before. It went completely, perfectly still. You think I had something to do with Daniel dying? I think, I said, that you forged a financial document with my name on it, that you've been hiding a fiancé who happens to be the attorney who drafted that document, and that you stood up at my husband's funeral and accused him of having a secret child rather than let me ask a single question about any of that. So no, Renee. I don't know what I think yet, but I know what it looks like. And I know you haven't denied a single piece of it. She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped, and for just a moment, I saw something underneath the composure she'd been wearing since the funeral. Something that looked almost like fear but not of me. You don't understand what Gregory's capable of, she said quietly. I didn't either, not at first. By the time I did, I was already. She stopped herself again, harder this time, like she'd caught herself walking toward a door she wasn't allowed to open. Already what, Renee? I have to go. She stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor, loud enough that 2 other customers looked over. I'm sorry, Mara. I am. You're not going to believe that, but I am. She left cash on the table, not enough to cover both coffees I noticed later, a small absurd detail that stuck with me, and walked out, and through the window I watched her get into a car, not the gray sedan this time but a black SUV, and pull away fast enough that she ran the yellow light at the corner. I sat there for a long time after she left, replaying one sentence. You don't understand what Gregory's capable of. I didn't know yet whether that was a confession or a warning, or the first true thing my sister had said to me since I stood up in that church and watched her hand a stranger's envelope toward my husband's casket. But I knew it mattered more than anything else she'd said. And 3 days later I would understand exactly why she'd run. 3 days after Renee ran out of that coffee shop, Priya called me at 6:15 a.m. I need you to come in, she said. I found the account the 86,000 went to. And I need you to see something else first before we talk about Renee. I drove to her office before the dry cleaner downstairs had even opened, the streets still gray with early light, and Priya was already at her desk with 3 new folders lined up, color-coded the way she always kept them, except this time her hands weren't as steady as they usually were when she slid the first one toward me. Gregory Hale isn't just an attorney, she said. I ran a deeper background check after our last conversation because something about the speed of that power of attorney letter bothered me. Most attorneys take weeks to draft something like that properly. This one was done in 4 days. What did you find? He's done this before. She turned her monitor toward me. A civil case from 6 years earlier in Ohio. A woman named Carol Ann Pruitt, 63 years old, had filed suit against her late husband's estate, alleging that a financial power of attorney had been forged using her signature, granting access to accounts to a man her stepdaughter had been dating. The man's name listed as a co-defendant was Gregory Hale. The case settled out of court, Priya said. Sealed settlement. No criminal charges filed. He kept his license. He moved his practice to Indiana 18 months later. She paused. 18 months ago is also when Callaway Property Holdings was registered. I stared at the screen at a stranger's name from a state I'd never lived in, and felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with grief anymore. He's done this before, I repeated. With someone else's family. I think your sister isn't the architect of this, Mrs. Whitfield. Priya said it carefully, like she'd been turning the sentence over before deciding to say it out loud. I think she might be the second person he's done it to. I didn't want to believe that. I want to be honest about that because the easier story, the one I'd already started telling myself in the 8 days since the funeral, was that my sister was simply someone I'd never really known, a person capable of cruelty I'd been too loyal to see. That story was painful, but it was simple. It let me be only angry. This new story was harder because it asked me to hold anger and pity in the same hand. I called Eleanor from the parking lot outside Priya's office and told her what we'd found. She was quiet for a long moment. I want you to think about something, she said finally. The girl who asked you 8 months ago what happens to the house if something happens to Daniel. Did that question sound like Renee to you? Or did it sound like something someone told her to ask? I hadn't thought of it that way. I thought of it that way now and I couldn't unthink it. I found Carol Ann Pruitt's phone number through a county record search Priya helped me run, and I called her that same afternoon, sitting in my car outside my own house because I couldn't make myself go inside and explain any of this to Eleanor's face a second time that day. Carol Ann picked up on the 4th ring. When I told her my name and started to explain why I was calling, she went quiet in a way I recognized now. The particular silence of someone who has been waiting years for this exact phone call. He found your stepdaughter through a real estate listing, I said, working from what Priya had pieced together. Is that close to right? He found my stepdaughter Hannah through a divorce support group, Carol Ann said. Her voice was steady but threadbare, worn down by something. She was vulnerable. He was charming. He's very charming, Mrs. Whitfield. I want you to understand that because everyone always asks me how a smart girl like Hannah didn't see it, and the answer is that smart has nothing to do with it. He's good at finding people who are scared of being alone. What happened to her? To Hannah? A long pause. She testified against him. At the deposition. Before we settled. Carol Ann's voice dropped lower. It cost her almost everything to do that. He told her the week before the deposition that if she went through with it he'd make sure her name ended up attached to the fraud too. He had documents with her signature on them by then. Forged, but they didn't look forged. He'd had 2 years to learn her handwriting. I closed my eyes in my car in my driveway, and thought about Renee's quarter turns of her coffee cup. About a fiancé nobody in our family had ever met. About a woman standing in a church holding an envelope, doing something so strange and cruel that I'd spent 8 days assuming it could only mean she'd become a person I no longer recognized. Mrs. Whitfield, Carol Ann said quietly, if your sister is with this man, I need you to understand something, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it. He doesn't need her to be a bad person for this to work. He just needs her to be afraid of him and in love with him at the same time. Those two things together make people do things they'd never otherwise do. I thanked her. I sat in my car for a long time after I hung up in the cold in my driveway in the last of the daylight, and I thought about the look on Renee's face when she said you don't understand what Gregory's capable of, and the fear underneath the composure, and I understood for the first time since I'd stood up in that church, that the story I'd been telling myself about my sister might not be the whole story at all. It didn't make what she'd done to me at that funeral hurt any less. But it changed what I thought I needed to do next. I didn't tell Eleanor everything Carol Ann had said, not at first. Some of it felt like it belonged to Renee to tell if she ever decided to tell it. But I told her enough. That Gregory Hale had a history, that there might be another victim underneath my sister, that this might be bigger and older than either of us had let ourselves imagine. Eleanor took it the way she took everything that year, with the kind of controlled grief that I came to understand was just how she'd learned to survive things. She poured 2 glasses of wine we didn't drink and sat across from me at the kitchen table with her index cards. Your father-in-law used to say, she told me, that the most dangerous people in any fraud case are never the ones who planned it. They're the ones who got pulled in and were too ashamed to ask for help before it was too late to undo. Do you think that's Renee? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I think your sister stood up in a church and tried to humiliate my dead son rather than let his widow ask a single honest question. I haven't forgiven that and I may not. But I also think a person can be both things, Mara. Cruel and cornered. I've lived a long time. I've seen it before. Priya's investigation accelerated after the call with Carol Ann. She traced the $86,000 transfer through its third intermediary bank and found where it had finally landed. An account in Gregory Hale's name alone, not joint with Renee, not connected to Callaway Property Holdings at all. A separate account. One Renee, as far as Priya could tell, didn't even know existed. That matters, Priya told me, tapping the printout. If your sister thought the money was going somewhere they'd built together and it was actually going somewhere only he could touch, that's not a partnership, Mrs. Whitfield. That's someone being used as the visible name on a crime built by someone smarter and more careful than she is. I thought about the gray sedan. The black SUV. Always someone else driving. There's something else, Priya said more carefully now. I pulled property records this morning. Gregory Hale purchased a condo in Scottsdale, Arizona, 11 days ago. $680,000. Closed remotely. She looked at me. 11 days ago is 3 days after your confrontation with Renee at the coffee shop. I felt the floor of the conversation shift under me. He's getting ready to leave, I said. I think he's getting ready to leave without her. I tried calling Renee that night. She didn't pick up. I tried again the next morning and the morning after that, and on the third morning, a text came through instead of a call, 4 words long, sent at 3:14 a.m. I can't talk right now. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I did something Priya had specifically told me not to do, because it broke every piece of careful, methodical advice she'd given me since the coffee shop. I drove to Renee's apartment. It was 7 a.m. The complex was quiet, sprinklers running on dead winter grass, somebody's dog barking 2 floors up. I knocked on her door for almost a full minute before I heard movement inside, and when she finally opened it, just a crack, chain still latched, I almost didn't recognize her. She'd lost more weight. There was a bruise on her forearm, pale yellow-green, the kind that's a week into healing, the kind she angled away from me without seeming to think about it, an old habit practiced. Mara, you can't be here. Renee. What happened to your arm? Nothing. I walked into something. The lie came too fast, too smooth, the kind of lie you've already told several times to several people. You need to go. Not until you tell me what's actually happening. Eleanor and I know about the Scottsdale condo, Renee. We know he closed on it 11 days ago. Kish. Alone. Something broke across her face, fast, there and gone, like a door opening half an inch before being shoved shut again. You don't know anything, she said, but her voice had lost its edge. It sounded, for the first time since the funeral, Like the voice I remembered from when we were girls, sharing a room, scared of the same things. Then tell me, I said. Tell me before he leaves you holding everything, Renee. Because that's what this looks like. That's exactly what this looks like. She looked at me for a long moment through the gap in the door, and for just a second, 1 second no more, I saw something underneath the fear. Calculation. Like she was doing the math on what it would cost her to tell me the truth, weighed against what it might cost her not to. Then a voice came from somewhere behind her, inside the apartment, male, even, unhurried. Renee? Who's at the door? Her whole body changed. I watched it happen, watched my sister fold inward like something collapsing, and she looked at me with an expression I will never forget as long as I live. Not anger, not fear exactly, but something closer to apology, the kind you give someone right before you do something you both already know you can't take back. You need to leave, she whispered. Please, Mara. For both of us. Just go. She closed the door. I heard the deadbolt turn. I stood in that hallway for a long time, listening to a stranger's dog bark 2 floors up, and I understood 2 things with total clarity for the first time since that morning in the church. The first was that my sister was in danger, real danger, the kind that leaves bruises shaped like a hand. The second was that whatever Gregory Hale was planning, the Scottsdale condo wasn't the end of it. It was the beginning of the part where he disappeared, and made sure no one could prove what he'd taken or from whom before he did. I called Priya from my car outside Renee's apartment complex, still shaking, and told her about the bruise, about the voice behind the door, about the deadbolt turning like a verdict. I'm calling a detective I trust, she said immediately. Today. This isn't just fraud anymore, Mrs. Whitfield, and I should have brought someone in sooner. The detective's name was Frank O'Yelleran, a heavy-set, soft-spoken man with 22 years in financial crimes who showed up at my kitchen table that evening with a legal pad and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned, the hard way, that rushing a case like this only taught the wrong people to run faster. I want to be straight with you, Mrs. Whitfield, he said after I'd walked him through everything. The funeral, the forged letter, the $86,000, Carol and Pruitt, the bruise. Gregory Hale is going to be hard to charge cleanly if your sister won't cooperate. Right now, on paper, she's the one with her name on the LLC. She's the one who requested the DNA test. She's the visible piece of this. He's made sure of that. She's not the one who built it. I believe you, O'Yelleran said. But belief isn't evidence. I need her to tell me on the record what she knows. And from what you're describing, she may be too afraid to do that. I thought of Hannah, Carol Ann's stepdaughter, threatened into silence the week before her deposition. I thought of forged documents with her signature on them, documents that didn't look forged because Gregory had had 2 years to learn her handwriting. He's done this exact thing before, I said. Threatened to make sure her name stays attached to it if she talks. O'Yelleran wrote something down, slow and deliberate. Then we need to give her a reason to believe that talking is safer than staying quiet. That's going to take time we may not have if he's already moving money to Arizona. That night, after O'Yelleran left, Eleanor asked me a question I hadn't let myself ask out loud yet. Maura, the power of attorney letter. The one with your forged signature on it. She set down her wine glass carefully. Have you asked yourself why Renee needed your signature on it at all? Why not just Daniel's? I hadn't. I'd been so focused on the forgery itself, the violation of it, my own name twisted into something I hadn't written, that I hadn't asked the next question. Because the account it controlled, I said slowly, working it out as I spoke, was joint. Mine and Daniel's both. They needed both our signatures to access it without raising flags. That's what I think too. I sat with that for a long moment. Eleanor, that means this was never just about Daniel's money. It was about ours. Mine too. I think, Eleanor said carefully, that you should call Priya first thing tomorrow and ask her to check every account with your name on it. Not just the ones Daniel managed. All of them. I didn't sleep well that night, turning over a single sick question. How much of my own financial life had I simply trusted Daniel to manage, the way I trusted Renee to be exactly who she'd always been to me? I'd signed things over the years without reading every line. I'd let Daniel handle the investment accounts, the retirement fund, the refinancing on the house, because that was the shape our marriage had taken, and because I trusted him completely, and apparently that trust had created exactly the kind of blind spot someone patient enough could walk through. Priya called at 9 a.m. the next morning, and for the first time since I'd met her, she sounded rattled. I found a 4th account, she said. This one's not connected to Callaway Property Holdings or to Daniel's business. It's a home equity line of credit against your house, Mrs. Whitfield. Opened 5 months ago. $94,000 drawn against it so far. The floor tilted again the way it kept tilting that year, one fresh collapse at a time. I never opened a home equity line. I know, Priya said. But your name is on it. Both signatures. Yours and Daniel's. Pause. Mrs. Whitfield, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly because it matters for what we do next. Is it possible, even slightly possible, that Daniel knew about this account and didn't tell you? The question landed like a slap, not because it was cruel, but because some small, exhausted part of me had already wondered the same thing in the dark at 3 a.m. in the days since the funeral. I don't know, I said, and it was the truest sentence I'd spoken in 11 days. I don't know anymore what my husband knew and didn't tell me. I don't know what my sister is, victim or accomplice or both. I don't know how much of my own life I was actually looking at this whole time versus how much I was just being shown. Priya was quiet for a moment. That's the right question to be sitting with, she said finally. I wish I could tell you it gets easier from here. It usually gets harder before it gets clear. But Mrs. Whitfield, I think we're close to the part where it gets clear. I think we're maybe a week out from understanding the whole shape of this. She was right about the timeline. She was wrong about how it would feel when we got there. 3 days later, Renee called me. Not Gregory's number. Not a blocked line. Her own phone at 11:47 p.m., and when I picked up I could hear that she was crying before she said a single word. Maura, I need you to listen to me and I need you to not ask questions yet, because I don't have much time before he gets back to the apartment. I need to tell you what's actually in that home equity account. And I need to tell you why I had that DNA test run at the funeral in the first place. Renee. It wasn't about Daniel having a secret child, she said, and her voice broke completely. It was never about that. I made it up. I needed an excuse to be alone with the funeral home's record system, just for 10 minutes before. She stopped. I heard her take a breath that shook all the way through the phone. Maura, I need you to understand something before I lose my nerve. I didn't do any of this because I wanted your money. Then why, Renee? Why any of it? The silence on the line lasted 4 full seconds. Because he told me, she said, that if I didn't help him get access to your accounts, he was going to make sure everyone found out what I did 3 years ago. And Maura, I never told you what I did 3 years ago. Nobody knows. Not even Eleanor. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the phone pressed so hard against my ear it hurt, and for the first time since that morning in the church, I understood that the story I thought I'd been investigating, fraud, forgery, a predatory fiancé, had a second, older story buried underneath it. One that belonged entirely to my sister. One she was about to tell me 11 days before everything would finally, completely come apart. Renee didn't finish telling me that night. The call cut off mid-sentence, a door I heard open somewhere behind her, a man's voice asking who she was talking to, and then nothing, dead air and a dial tone, and 40 minutes of me sitting at my kitchen table calling her number over and over while Eleanor stood behind me with her hand on my shoulder, not saying anything because there wasn't anything to say. She didn't answer. I called Detective O'Yelleran instead at midnight, and he didn't sound annoyed at the hour, just alert, the way I imagine he'd sounded for 22 years whenever a case finally started moving. I'll have someone do a welfare check at the apartment, he said. Quietly. We don't want to spook Hale before we have enough to hold him on something. The welfare check came back the next morning with nothing. Renee was home, alone, and told the officer everything was fine. She'd simply had an argument with her boyfriend and hung up the phone. Standard. Nothing actionable. The officer left. I knew it wasn't nothing. I just couldn't prove it yet. For 4 days Renee didn't call back and I lived inside a particular kind of agony. The waiting kind, the kind where every unread message and every silent phone feels like evidence of something terrible, and you have no way to act on the fear because acting might be exactly what makes it worse. On the 5th day something happened that felt for about 6 hours like the breakthrough we'd all been waiting for. Priya called at 2 p.m. breathless in a way I'd never heard from her. I found the original source account. The one everything traces back to. It's not Callaway Property Holdings, it's not the home equity line. It's older than both of those, Mrs. Whitfield. Goes back 3 years. And it's not in Gregory Hale's name at all. My heart was pounding. Whose name is it in? It's in your sister's name. Tilly. Opened 3 years ago before Gregory Hale, as far as I can tell, was even in the picture. For one terrible vertiginous moment, the entire shape of the story I'd been building, Renee as victim, Renee as someone manipulated and cornered and threatened into complicity, collapsed. 3 years ago, I said slowly. Before any of this. Before Gregory. Before Gregory, Priya confirmed. Mrs. Whitfield, I think I need to revise what I told you last week. I think your sister might be the one who started this. I think Gregory Hale may have come into the picture later. Not as the architect but as someone she brought in, because what she'd started had grown beyond what she could manage alone. I sat with that for the rest of the afternoon and it felt like grief all over again. A fresh kind, the kind reserved specifically for the death of a story you'd let yourself believe in. I had let myself believe my sister was being used. I had let myself feel something like pity for her standing outside her apartment looking at that bruise. And now I was being told that the account at the very root of everything, older than Gregory, older than the funeral, older than any of it, belonged to her alone. Eleanor found me sitting on the back porch as the sun went down, not moving, the same stillness I'd had in the church, and she didn't say anything for a long time. She just sat beside me. I don't know what to believe anymore, I told her finally. I thought I understood what this was. I thought I understood my own sister. Every time I think I've reached the bottom of it, there's another floor underneath. That's usually how the truth works, Eleanor said quietly. It's rarely the first explanation. It's rarely even the second one. I called Renee's number again that night, not really expecting an answer, and she picked up on the first ring, like she'd been holding the phone waiting. Mara. Her voice was different. Steadier somehow, like something inside her had finally settled into place after weeks of shaking. I have maybe 10 minutes. He thinks I'm in the shower. Priya found an account, Renee. 3 years old. Your name. Before Gregory. My voice was harder than I meant it to be, all the pity from the week before curdling into something colder. Tell me the truth. Were you the one who started this? A long silence. Then quietly. Yes. The single word landed like a stone dropped into still water, and I felt every assumption I'd been building for 2 weeks ripple outward and disappear. But not the way you think, she said quickly before I could speak. Mara, please. You need to let me explain the whole thing from the actual beginning, not the part you've been able to see. Because what happened 3 years ago, it's the reason any of this exists at all. It's the reason I was so afraid of what Gregory knew. It's the reason I stood up in that church and did the single worst thing I've ever done in my life. Then tell me. My hands were shaking again the way they had in the church holding that program with Daniel's photo on it. Tell me everything, Renee. Right now. Before he comes out of that bathroom and you lose your nerve again. I heard her take a breath, long and unsteady, the sound of someone about to set down something she'd been carrying alone for 3 years. It started with Dad, she said. And the moment she said it, I understood that everything I thought I knew about this story, about my sister, about my husband, about the family I'd grown up in, was about to come apart completely, and rebuild itself into something I never could have predicted standing in that church, watching her walk toward my husband's casket with an envelope in her hand. Dad didn't just sell the hardware store, Mara. He sold it because he was already in debt to people you don't walk away from. I found out 2 months before he died, going through his files because he'd asked me to help him with his taxes. He trusted me with things like that, you remember, because I was the one who stayed. I remembered. I'd left for college. Renee had stayed in Westfield, in the orbit of our father's moods, his store, his slow unraveling. I had built a life 400 miles away and called it independence. I had never once asked myself what it cost her to be the one who stayed. He'd borrowed against the store, against the house, against things that weren't even his to borrow against. Private lenders. The kind who don't send polite letters when you're late. Her voice had gone very flat, the voice of someone reciting something they'd rehearsed in their head 1,000 times, late at night, alone. I paid it off. All of it. $81,000 over 2 years, money I told you was for a bookkeeping business that never existed, Mara. There was no business. There was never a business. I made it up because I couldn't tell you the truth. Because the truth was that our father had put a gun to his own head over money he owed men who would have come looking for the rest of us once he was gone. I felt something crack open in my chest, an old assumption I'd never questioned. That Renee drifted, that Renee never landed, that Renee was the soft one, the unsteady one, the sister I quietly, secretly believed I had to be stronger than. You let me think you were struggling, I said slowly. All those years. The rent. Her. I thought I was helping you. You were helping me pay off a debt I never told you existed, because if I told you I'd have had to tell you why, and I couldn't. I couldn't tell you Dad did what he did to himself because of money he couldn't repay. I couldn't let that be the last true thing you knew about him. Her voice cracked. So I built a fake business and a fake failure and let you believe I was the disappointment, because the alternative was telling my big sister that our father got involved with people who would have hurt us, and that I'd spent 2 years making sure they never got the chance. I sat in absolute silence, the phone pressed to my ear, and felt the entire architecture of my own family rebuild itself in real time. Gregory found out, she said. 18 months ago. Not because I told him, because he's good at finding things, Mara, that's what he does, that's his whole. She stopped, started again. He found old wire transfer records. He pieced together what I'd done, who I'd paid, and he told me he could make it look like something it wasn't. Like I'd been laundering money. Like I'd been involved with the people Dad owed, not paying them off to protect this family but working with them. He said he had a friend at the county prosecutor's office who'd take one look at the pattern and see exactly what he wanted them to see, not what was actually true. That's not possible. You didn't do anything wrong. You paid off a debt with your own money. It doesn't matter what's true, Mara, it matters what's provable, and he made sure what was provable could be twisted into something ugly. He started small. Small favors. Co-signing on an LLC just to help him close a deal faster, he said. Then bigger ones. By the time I understood what he actually was, I was already in too deep to get out without him following through on what he'd threatened. I didn't move. I sat at my kitchen table in the house I'd shared with Daniel for 9 years, and tried to hold the full shape of what I was being told. My sister hadn't started as a predator. She'd started as a 16-year-old, then a 20-year-old, then a 30-year-old woman quietly bleeding herself dry to protect a family that had no idea what she was protecting them from. And somewhere in that loyalty, that exact same loyalty I'd never once doubted in her, the loyalty I'd loved her for since we were girls sharing a bedroom, a man had found a thread and pulled. The DNA test, I said finally. At the funeral. Tell me what that was actually for. Renee's breath shook on the other end of the line. Gregory needed 10 minutes alone in the funeral home's record system that day. Not for a DNA test. There was never a real lab technician, Mara, there was never a real test. He needed access to the funeral home's financial software, because Daniel's estate account was routed through it for the service fees, and he needed a window where everyone's attention was somewhere else. I was the distraction. He told me exactly what to say. He told me a paternity accusation was the only thing dramatic enough to make sure nobody questioned why I needed 10 minutes alone with Hugh Pemberton's computer. The room tilted. You didn't even believe what you said in that church, I said. It wasn't a question. No. Her voice broke completely now, the composure gone, just my sister, just Renee, the girl who used to forge my signature on permission slips so we could laugh about it together. I stood up in front of 300 people and accused your dead husband of having a secret child, and I knew it wasn't true the entire time I was saying it, because Gregory told me to, and because by then I was so afraid of him that I would have said almost anything he asked me to. I want to tell you that in that moment I felt only sympathy. I didn't. I felt rage and grief and something that might have been love trying to survive underneath both of them, all at once, none of them canceling the others out. You let me believe you'd become a stranger, I said. You let me stand in that church and watch you try to destroy what was left of my husband's name, and you let me spend 2 weeks thinking my sister was either a monster or a victim, when the truth was you were trying to protect this family the exact same way you'd been trying to protect it since you were 16 years old. Just badly. Just so badly, Renee. I know. Why didn't you come to me? Any time in 3 years. Any single time. Because you'd already left, Mara. It wasn't an accusation. It was just true, and that was worse. You built a life. A husband. A house. I didn't want to be the sister who dragged you back into Dad's mess the second you'd gotten free of it. I told myself I was protecting you. Maybe I was protecting myself from finding out you'd resent me for it. I sat with that in my kitchen in the dark and understood, finally, completely, that the twist in this story was never about whether my sister was good or evil. It was that she had spent her entire adult life paying a debt that was never hers to carry alone, and the silence she kept to protect me had become the exact same silence a predator used to destroy her. Where are you right now? I asked. Tonight. This minute. In the bathroom. The water's still running. He thinks I'm in the shower. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. Mara, he's leaving for Scottsdale in 4 days. And he told me yesterday that once he's gone, he's going to make sure the prosecutor's friend sees everything pointed at me. All of it. The LLC, the home equity line, the $86,000. He's going to disappear clean, and I'm going to be the only name left standing in the wreckage. I closed my eyes. Then we have 4 days, I said, to make sure that isn't what happens. I called Detective O'Yelleran at 6 a.m., before the sun was fully up, and told him everything Renee had said. He listened without interrupting. The way I'd come to learn was just how he processed information, letting it settle before he responded. If she's willing to go on record, he said finally, today this morning before he leaves for that bathroom and gets suspicious about how long she's been gone, that changes everything. Right now we have circumstantial financial evidence and a pattern that matches a prior case in Ohio. What we don't have is anyone willing to say on the record that Gregory Hale orchestrated it. If your sister gives us that, we can move. She's terrified of him. I understand that. I've worked cases like this before. We can offer her protection, but Mrs. Whitfield, I won't lie to you. The next few days are the most dangerous ones. Men like this, when they feel the walls closing in, they don't always leave quietly. I thought about the bruise on Renee's forearm, pale yellow-green, angled away from me without her seeming to think about it. Then we move fast, I said. Renee met us 2 hours later, not at her apartment, but at a Sheraton off the interstate where O'Yelleran had arranged a room under a name that wasn't hers. She'd told Gregory she was going to get her hair done before a family lunch, a small ordinary lie inside a much larger one, And I watched my sister walk into that hotel room looking like someone who hadn't fully slept in 3 weeks, and felt something in my chest that was equal parts fury and a grief so old it had no clean edges left. She gave her statement to O'Yelleran for 3 hours. I sat in the corner of the room mostly silent, while my sister laid out in exact and devastating detail everything she told me the night before. The debt, the lie about the bookkeeping business, Gregory finding the wire transfer records, the slow escalating blackmail that had turned a frightened 28-year-old into a 41-year-old man's instrument. "I have copies," she said partway through, sliding a flash drive across the table. "I started keeping them 2 months ago. Texts where he tells me exactly what to say. The contract for the Scottsdale condo which I wasn't supposed to know about. I found it on his laptop while he was in the shower. I've been documenting things for weeks, detective. I just didn't know how to use any of it without him finding out, and without it destroying what was left of my relationship with my sister at the same time." O'Yelleran looked at the flash drive for a long moment, then at Renee with something that might have been respect. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. "This changes the entire shape of the case." The arrest happened 3 days later on a Thursday morning at 6:40 a.m., at a private airfield outside Indianapolis where Gregory Hale had chartered a small plane to Scottsdale under a name that wasn't quite his own, close enough to pass a cursory check, sloppy enough that O'Yelleran's team caught it within an hour of the flight plan being filed. I wasn't there. Renee was, at her own insistence, standing behind a chain-link fence at the edge of the tarmac with 2 federal agents who'd joined the case once the Ohio pattern confirmed interstate fraud, watching a man she'd been engaged to for over a year get pulled out of a rental car in a gray cashmere coat, the same unhurried confidence in his face that Carol and Pruitt had described on the phone weeks earlier. "He's very charming, Mrs. Whitfield. That's what makes it work." Renee told me later that he looked directly at her across that tarmac, and that for one terrible second she expected to feel afraid the way she had for 18 months. Instead she said she felt nothing at all. Just tired. Just done. He said one thing to her before they put him in the car, loud enough that the agent standing nearest wrote it down for the record. "You'll regret this." "I already regret most of it," Renee told him. "Just not this part." The charges when they came ran longer than I expected. Wire fraud, identity theft, forgery, witness tampering tied to the Ohio case once Carol and Pruitt agreed to testify again, and because of the home equity line drawn against my house without my knowledge against my forged signature. A charge connected directly to me as a named victim separate from Renee's. 17 federal counts total, once the prosecutors finished building the case across both states. Renee was charged too. 2 counts, far lesser, for her role in the forged power of attorney letter and the false statements at the funeral. Her attorney, a careful, exhausted-looking woman named Diane Okafor, negotiated a plea agreement built almost entirely on the evidence Renee had handed over herself. The flash drive, her cooperation, the documented pattern of coercion that the Ohio case helped corroborate. "Your sister could have run," Detective O'Yelleran told me, the week the plea agreement was finalized. "She had 4 days warning before that flight to Scottsdale. She could have disappeared with him or disappeared from him, gone somewhere none of us would have found her in time. Instead she walked into a hotel room and told the truth, knowing it would cost her almost everything." He paused. "That matters, Mrs. Whitfield. Not legally maybe. But it matters." I thought about that for a long time. About a 16-year-old girl alone in Westfield, finding out her father had put their family in danger over money he couldn't repay. About a 30-year-old woman standing in a hallway hiding a bruise, choosing, finally after 18 months of silence, to choose her sister over her own survival instinct. It didn't undo what she'd done at that funeral. But it was the truest thing she'd done in 3 years. The sentencing happened 8 months later in a federal courthouse in downtown Indianapolis, the kind of building with marble floors that make every footstep sound like an announcement. I hadn't expected the wait to be that long. Priya told me gently that federal fraud cases of this size almost never move quickly. There were 2 states involved, a prior case that had to be formally reopened on Carol and Pruitt's behalf, forensic accounting that took months to fully document across 4 separate accounts. 86,000 here. 94,000 there. The original 81,000 Renee had paid off 3 years earlier, which the prosecution carefully, deliberately, did not treat as part of the fraud. Diane Okafor made sure of that, presenting it instead as exactly what it was. A daughter quietly protecting her family, badly used by the very act of protection. I sat in the second row of the courtroom between Eleanor and Renee, on the morning of the sentencing. It was the first time the 3 of us had sat together in public since the funeral. Gregory Hale wore a navy suit, not the cashmere coat from the tarmac, and he looked, even then, even facing 17 federal counts, like a man who believed some version of charm might still pull him out of the room he was standing in. He didn't look at Renee. He looked at the judge, mostly with the particular calm of someone who had spent his whole adult life learning exactly how to perform composure. I gave a victim impact statement. I hadn't planned to write much. Diane had warned me the judge preferred concise, specific testimony over broad emotional appeals. But when I stood up at that podium, what came out wasn't really about the money at all. My husband spent the last months of his life quietly trying to protect me, I said, without ever telling me what he'd found, because he didn't want to worry me before he was certain. I will never get to ask him what he was planning to do next. I will never get to thank him for noticing what I didn't. What this man took from me isn't measured only in dollars. It's measured in the conversation I never got to have with my husband before he died, about the people closest to us, and what they were capable of. I heard someone in the gallery, Eleanor I think, make a small sound, quickly swallowed. My sister sat across from me at his funeral and accused him of something monstrous, on this man's instructions, to buy 10 minutes of access to a computer system. I continued. It was the worst thing she has ever done to me. I don't think I'll ever fully forgive it, even now, even knowing why. But I've also learned this year that the people who hurt us are not always the architects of their own cruelty. Sometimes they are simply the last hand on a knife someone else sharpened for years. That doesn't undo the wound. But it changes what justice should look like. I sat down. Diane Okafor, beside Renee, reached over and squeezed her hand. The judge sentenced Gregory Hale to 22 years. Citing the pattern across 2 states, the documented coercion of at least 2 victims, the deliberate targeting of grieving and vulnerable women, and an attempted flight that the prosecution argued, successfully, demonstrated a complete absence of remorse. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, that same navy suit, and as he passed our row he looked finally at Renee. She didn't look away. I hope it was worth it, he said quietly, almost gently, the most unsettling tone he could have chosen. It wasn't, Renee said. None of it ever was. That's the part you never understood. He didn't respond. The bailiff moved him forward, and that was the last time either of us ever saw him. Renee's sentencing came separately 2 weeks later, before a different judge who had clearly read the full file, including Carol and Pruitt's testimony about Hannah, including Detective O'Yelleran's statement about Renee's cooperation, including the 18 months of escalating coercion the prosecution itself laid out in detail rather than minimizing. She received 18 months, with significant credit for cooperation, plus 3 years of supervised probation and a restitution order tied to the home equity line drawn against my house. Full repayment, a structure Diane Okafor and I worked out together quietly outside the courtroom, in a way that let Renee pay back what had been taken without it becoming another debt she carried in silence. Before she was led away to begin serving her sentence, the judge allowed a brief moment, not customary, Diane told me later, but something she'd specifically requested, for Renee to address the courtroom. She stood, and she was shaking, and for the first time in 8 months I watched my sister speak without flattening her voice into the calm, careful register she'd used through every deposition and hearing since the funeral. I spent 3 years protecting a secret because I was ashamed of what it meant about our family, she said. And that shame is exactly what let a man use me as a weapon against the one person who never stopped believing in me, even after I gave her every reason to stop. Her voice cracked. Maura, I know I don't get to ask you for anything. I just need you to know that the version of me who stood up in that church isn't the only version of me that exists. I'm going to spend a long time proving that. I understand if you don't believe me yet. I didn't say anything in that courtroom. I wasn't ready to, not yet, not out loud in front of strangers and bailiffs and a judge waiting to move the docket forward. But I nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. Not that day. It was something smaller and more honest. An acknowledgement that the woman standing in front of that judge, finally telling the truth with her whole shaking voice, was someone I still recognized underneath everything. That had to be enough for now. It would take longer than I expected for it to become something more than that. I want to tell you that the year ended there, in that courtroom, with a nod that meant something and a sentence that felt like justice. It didn't. Grief and fraud don't resolve themselves on a docket schedule, no matter how clean the paperwork looks once a case is closed. I kept the house, though some nights I wasn't sure I wanted to. Daniel had died in that bathroom doorway, and for months I couldn't walk past it without my chest tightening, without that specific cold drop in my stomach returning fresh, every single time, as if my body refused to learn what my mind already knew. That the danger wasn't there anymore, that the danger had been wearing a Navy suit and was 22 years into a federal sentence 3 states away. I started seeing a grief counselor named Dr. Esther Okonkwo, on Tuesdays in a small office with a window that looked out onto a parking lot, which felt right somehow. There was nothing scenic about what I was carrying, and I didn't want a view that suggested otherwise. You're allowed to grieve 2 things at once, she told me, the 3rd or 4th session in, when I admitted I didn't know anymore whether I was mourning Daniel or mourning the sister I thought I'd had. People expect grief to be a single, clean line. It's almost never that. You're allowed to miss your husband and feel betrayed by your sister and feel relieved that the truth finally surfaced, all in the same hour. That doesn't make any one of those feelings less real. I didn't heal in a straight line. I want to be honest about that because every version of this story I'd ever watched before it happened to me made recovery look fast and clean. A montage, 6 months condensed into 30 seconds of softer lighting. It wasn't like that. I checked the locks on my house 3 times some nights, a habit that took almost a year to fully fade. I flinched at gray sedans in parking lots for longer than I'd like to admit, even though I knew logically that the car itself had never mattered, that it had only ever been a symbol my mind had latched onto because it needed somewhere to put the fear. Eleanor stayed in the guest room for 4 months, longer than either of us had originally planned, and neither of us ever formally discussed her leaving. She just slowly, gradually started spending more nights at her own house again, until one week she was there more than she was with me, and I realized with a small ache that this particular chapter, the two of us at that kitchen table with her index cards, building a case against the people who'd hurt her son and my husband, was quietly closing. "You don't need me here every night anymore," she told me, the week she finally moved her last box of things home. "That's not a sad thing, Mara. That's the thing we were working toward." She still came every Sunday though. She still does. Priya Bundari and I stayed in touch long after her work on the case was finished. She'd send me brief updates sometimes. Carol and Pruitt's restitution finally clearing, Hannah enrolling in a paralegal program, small good things scattered across 2 states full of people Gregory Hale had touched and damaged. I think she understood better than almost anyone that the financial resolution and the emotional one were 2 entirely separate processes, running on 2 entirely different timelines, and that I needed updates on both. "You did everything right," she told me once the last time we met for coffee almost a year after the funeral. "I want you to actually hear that, not just nod at it. You didn't ignore what was in front of you. You followed it even when following it cost you something every single step." "It cost me my sister," I said. For a while, Priya agreed. "Not forever from what you've told me." I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, turning it over the way Renee used to turn her coffee cup, a quarter turn at a time, deciding how much of something to let myself believe. The Whitfield Callaway Restitution Fund, Diane Okafor's idea, formalized about 10 months after the sentencing, used a portion of the recovered assets, the parts that had been successfully clawed back from Gregory Hale's accounts before the Scottsdale condo sale finalized, to set up a small resource specifically for people navigating financial fraud connected to grief. Widows, widowers, adult children managing a parent's estate, anyone who discovered the way I had that loss makes people uniquely vulnerable to exactly the kind of predation Gregory specialized in. It wasn't large. It wasn't going to undo anything, but it felt like the right shape for what had happened to become. Not erased, never erased, but turned, eventually, into something that protected someone else. Hannah, Carol Ann's stepdaughter, was the first person to use it, 18 months after Gregory's sentencing, when she discovered a similar scheme being run by someone entirely unconnected to him, against an elderly widow in her apartment building. She caught it in 9 days, she told me on the phone, because she knew exactly what to look for now. "I learned what to look for the hardest possible way," she said. "I figured the least I could do was make sure I actually used it." I understood that completely. Renee served 14 of her 18 months before her release date moved up slightly for good behavior, and I drove 3 hours each way to visit her twice a month, sitting across a scratched plastic table in a visiting room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, learning how to rebuild a relationship in 50-minute increments. The first few visits were mostly silence. We didn't know how to talk to each other yet, not really. There was too much sitting underneath every ordinary sentence, every, "How are you holding up?" loaded with everything neither of us said out loud. But by the 4th or 5th visit something started to shift. She told me about a women's financial literacy class she'd started teaching to other inmates, using nothing but what she'd learned the hard way. I told her about Dr. Okonkwo, about the locks I still checked some nights, about Eleanor's Sunday visits. We were learning each other again, slowly, the way you learn someone for the second time after the first version of them turns out to have been incomplete. "I used to think being the one who stayed in Westfield made me the weak one," she told me during one of the last visits before her release. "Watching you build your life from a distance. I think I needed Dad's debt and then Gregory to finally prove to myself I was right about that. And it took losing almost everything to understand I had it backwards the whole time." "You're not the weak one, Renee. You never were. I know that now. I didn't always." She came to live in Westfield again after her release, in a small apartment near where we'd grown up, close enough to Eleanor that the two of them improbably became something like friends. Eleanor bringing casseroles on Sundays, Renee fixing the older woman's garden beds in exchange, two people who'd both been hurt by the same set of lies finding an unexpected, careful kind of peace with each other. I didn't see her every week. Healing wasn't a straight line for either of us, and there were stretches where the distance between us felt necessary, not punishing. Just two people figuring out separately who they were now that the worst thing that could happen to them already had. But we found our way back to something. Not the unquestioning closeness of girls sharing a bedroom in Westfield, Indiana. Something steadier than that, built on the specific kind of trust that only exists after two people have seen each other at their absolute worst and chosen to stay anyway. A year and a half after her release, Renee stood beside me at the small ceremony marking the Restitution Fund's second anniversary. A modest gathering in a community center, nothing grand, just the people it had actually helped. Anna was there. Carolyn flew in from Ohio. Eleanor sat in the front row in a navy suit that wasn't so different from the one she'd worn to Daniel's funeral, except this time her hands weren't clenched white in her lap. I thought about that church often in the years that followed, the rattling sound of a funeral program in my shaking hands, the envelope my sister carried down the aisle, the moment I believed for 4 terrible seconds that my husband had been a stranger. He hadn't been. He'd spent the last months of his life quietly trying to protect me, the same way Renee had spent years quietly trying to protect our family, both of them carrying weight alone because they loved me enough to think I shouldn't have to carry it too. I understood now that love and secrecy can wear the exact same face, and that the difference between protection and harm sometimes isn't visible until everything finally breaks open. I still live in the house Daniel and I bought together. I walk past the bathroom doorway now without my chest tightening every time. Some days I forget for whole stretches that any of this happened at all, and then I'll catch myself smiling at something small, an ordinary Tuesday, Renee texting a photo of her garden, Eleanor calling to ask if I want to come for Sunday dinner, and I'll remember exactly how far we all had to come to get back to ordinary. My sister crashed my husband's funeral with a lie dressed up as a DNA test, and for a long time I thought that was the worst thing that would ever happen to either of us. It wasn't the worst thing. It was just the moment everything we'd both been hiding finally had nowhere left to go. We're still here. Both of us. That, in the end, turned out to be the only ending that mattered.